Welcome to the Paul Greene-Dennis read-alongs of nonfiction here. Paul Greene-Dennis here. And if you saw me earlier, I voiced my objections about a Hall of Fame wrestler, The Undertaker, and a situation that involved him and his wife, and more importantly, his former co-host of his podcast that was rising rapidly, 6 feet under. But that's in the past, and now I'm here to do live readings. More importantly, to continue reading this chapter that I've always wanted to read to you guys. One Nation Under Blackmail, Volume 1, Chapter 9, Tech Treason. And as you recall, when we got into this chapter, we were getting into Robert Maxwell and his involvement. And not just his involvement, but more importantly, now we're starting to get more into the weaves of Israeli intelligence, not just Israel's involvement, but the Promise software that could literally peep into anybody as long as they're in a database. And how the CIA, through him specifically, the CIA and Israel were all working together, plus other intelligences from Saudi Arabia and other dark world dealings. And we're going to continue more in the weeds of this chapter of Tech Treason. If you are in the chat, please say hello. And those who are coming along and just want to listen more and find out more, you're more than welcome to do so. Hey, Sherry. Hey. And with that, we are keeping it rolling. One Nation Under Blackmail, Volume 1, Chapter 9, Part 2 of Tech Treason. I am here. The next portion of this chapter, E-Systems. Here we go. Another company that surfaces in the allegations surrounding Systematics and the Inslaw affair is E-Systems, a Dallas-based defense contractor specializing in computer software and systems. Authors James Norman and J. Orland Grab have both discussed E-Systems as having a particularly close relationship with Systematics. However, the CEO of Alltel, a successor company to Systematics, has denied that any such relationship exists. Among the claims made by Grab and Norman is that sensitive E-Systems computer code ended up in the hands of Israel a mere 30 days after it was first deployed by the NSA. While parsing out the details of the connections between E-Systems and Systematics is difficult, E-Systems did maintain a tight connection with another corporation located at the heart of the Inslaw affair, Wackenhut. William Rayborn, who had served as director of the CIA under President Lyndon B. Johnson, joined the board of directors of Wackenhut in 1971. Reports show that by at least 1977, he had also joined the board of these systems. Wackenhut annual reports illustrate that, for a time, he served on the board of these companies simultaneously. E-Systems connections to the intelligence community are long-standing. The company began in the 1960s as LTV Electro Systems, a wholly owned subsidiary of Temcovort. Hold on for a second. Gotta close the door. All right, I'm back. Sorry about that. Sorry about that. I'll go back to the previous paragraph. While parsing out the details of the connections between E-Systems and Systematics is difficult, E-Systems did maintain a tight connection with another corporation located at the heart of the Insular affair, Wackenhut. William Rayborn, who has served as the director under the CIA under President Lyndon B. Johnson, joined the board of directors of Wackenhut in 1971. Press reports show that by at least 1977, he had also joined the board of E-Systems. Wackenhut annual reports illustrate that, for a time, he served on the board of these companies simultaneously. E-Systems' connections to the intelligence community are long-standing. The company began in the 1960s as LTV Electro Systems, a wholly owned subsidiary of Temcovort, LTV, the Texas-based defense contractor that was then rapidly expanding due to military contracts related to the Vietnam War. As discussed in Chapter 6, LTV shared multiple connections with First International Bankshares, the CIA-linked bank that George H.W. Bush joined in 1976. LTV Electro Systems held a major share of the defense contracts that LTV received, having been consolidated with another major LTV subsidiary, LTV Military Electronics Division. All these companies. In 1972, LTV Electro Systems was spun off as an independent company and rechristened as E-Systems under the leadership of John W. Dixon, its new president and chairman. As the presence of William Rayborn on its board shows, E-Systems maintained a cozy relationship with the CIA and other U.S. intelligence agencies. E-Systems has attempted to keep this relationship under wraps, with much of the company's projects shrouded under confidentiality agreements. Nevertheless, there have been occasions when the company's intelligence ties have bubbled up to the surface. In 1994, for example, Washington Post journalist John Mintz wrote that the CIA employees who are experts in high technology are automatic hires for the firm, a former CIA official said. E-Systems made it a point to say, when you retire, come work for us. E-Systems has one of the more unique relationships with the agency. He added, calling it chummy. A staff member of a Congressional Intelligence Committee said E-Systems is virtually indistinguishable from the agency it serves. Congress will ask for a briefing from E-Systems, and the CIA program manager shows up, he said. Sometimes he gives the briefing. They're interchangeable. You don't say. Among the known collaborations between E-Systems and the agency included the construction of ground stations in China used to eavesdrop on Soviet satellites in flight, the information from which was then shared with China. In another notable instance taking place in 1975, E-Systems purchased AirAsia, one of the CIA's proprietary airlines that was hidden as a civilian-staffed aviation company. The sale garnered considerable controversy at the time, as E-Systems only paid $1.9 million for the front company, despite the fact that AirAsia's net worth was calculated to be approximately $3.4 million at the time of the sale. Several years later, in 1977, E-Systems became involved in Operation Condor, a DEA and U.S. Customs supported Mexican government initiative to crack down on the ballooning drug trade. It was a completely different operation than the notorious South American operation of the same name. On hand to support Condor was the CIA, with Evergreen International Aviation providing Mexican authorities with planes and pilots. That same year, Evergreen had absorbed Intermountain Aviation, a CIA proprietary airline, and placed the former head of all CIA air operations on its board of directors. Wow. E-Systems was contracted to provide maintenance for Evergreen's planes actively participated in Condor, attacks no doubt related to the company's wider contracts with U.S. Customs for electronic technology and aircraft maintenance for drug interdiction purposes. Remarkably, and perhaps unsurprisingly, Condor was an abject failure, and it effectively allowed the drug trade to continue unabated. Where planes were supposed to be spraying herbicides on drug core, the tanks were frequently found to instead contain water, while officials involved with the program had a tendency to shake down drug cultivators in exchange for protection from spraying. Tom Farrer notes that Condor, in fact, encouraged the deepening centralization and concentration of the drug trade within a small handful of powerful cartel-linked groups. As a result of this policy initiative, he writes, the Mexican drug industry came under the control of entrepreneurial organizations that were fewer in number, stronger in resources, and more dangerous to society and government. Chief among the drug traffickers that rose in prominence in this time was Felix Gallardo and his criminal associate, Juan Mata Ballesteros. As noted in Chapter 7, both of these figures were linked to counter-support activities and, in the case of Mata, to CIA-linked aviation companies. E-Systems may have also been linked to the activities of both Ted Shackley and his team and that of Robert Vesco in Libya. As discussed in Chapter 6, a point of intersection between these two networks was the British company Lorno, its infamous leader Tiny Rowland, and his right-hand man Edward Ducan. To briefly recap, Ducan, whose duties extended beyond Lorno to act as liquidator for the Vesco looted Investors Overseas Services (IOS), sat on the board of a Lorno Freight subsidiary called Tradewinds, which was accused of running arms into Libya on behalf of Shackley's close associate, Edwin Wilson. At this same time, Vesco was involved in a number of Libyan affairs, several which blew back on the Carter administration, an administration despised by Shackley and a number of his former CIA colleagues. One of these was an attempt to get embargoed planes released to Libya, which included a number of C-130 aircraft. At around this same time, E-Systems was in talks to update a number of C-130s located in Australia that a group of individuals was attempting to sell to Libya. This group was led by Lt. Bill Ransom, head of a Texas-based aircraft broker firm called Global Jet Sales, and included Max Park of Parmax Inc., which shared addresses with Ransom's Global Jet, Stanley Mann, a petroleum broker, and Admiral E.L. Whitey Freiter, an aviation consultant and retired military officer. Also involved was Jack Richards, an aircraft broker from Oklahoma City. Richards' firm, Onyx Aviation, was later named during the Iran-Contra hearings as one of the firms that had provided aircraft for the Contras in Nicaragua. Ransom's attempts to sell the C-130s to Libya ultimately fell apart, and it isn't clear if E-Systems ended up working on the aircraft. The route the planes ended up taking, however, is still quite interesting. Aviation records show that a number of these planes passed from the hands of Ransom and Park to Ford of Lajos, a powerful San Francisco law firm. The Ford in Ford of Lajos was John Ford, who had ties to another aviation company, TNG Aviation, based in Chandler, Arizona. Damn. Chandler is a suburb in Phoenix, roughly an hour's drive from Marana, where the aforementioned CIA-linked Evergreen Aviation maintained its aircraft maintenance center. According to whistleblower Gary Adel, himself a former Evergreen pilot, TNG-owned aircraft were doing work for Southern Air and Evergreen in Saudi Arabia and Abu Dhabi. That was disguised as contract work for Bechtel. From Ford of Lajos, the C-130s ended up in a number of intriguing locations. Records show that a number ended up in the hands of an aviation concern owned by the Aboitiz family in the Philippines, who had grown particularly wealthy and powerful under the Marcos regime. Another was sold to Aviacio of Bogota, Colombia, a company described in the press as part of the air wing of the Colombian cartels, having been involved in drug smuggling since 1982. Yet another ended up parked at Mena, Arkansas, before being bought up by a Miami company, African Air Trans. This is the same C-130 that was discussed in the previous chapter, having been seized by customs for arms trafficking violations. As discussed in that chapter, African Air Trans was itself a front for an unnamed Israeli living in Panama. Ooh. The question remains, was the initial attempt, which involved E-Systems, to sell these 130s to Libya part of the broader calculus involving the country by Vesco, Shackley, and others? Answers to this question remain elusive, though there is one provocative tie that suggests these may all have been interrelated incidents. Stanley Mann, the member of Ransom's group that attempted the initial C-130 sale, was closely connected to and had provided financing for Andrew Rocks, the head of Rocks International, a subsidiary of the Phillips, Apple, and Walden brokerage house in New York. The classified U.S. State Department cables showed that Rocks was also associated with Tiny Rowland, as well as Henry Kissinger, and had acted as a back channel between the government and the loyal chief concerning African affairs. Wow, this high-tech treason is getting crazy. Whew. Now we're getting to the man who knew too much. Don't we all? Isn't it? I feel like there's always something about somebody who knew too much. Anyway, the man who knew too much. Not only was the Promise scandal linked with the U.S. Department of Justice, the CIA, and Israeli intelligence, but major elements of organized crime could also be found in its web. For instance, one of the key figures involved in the Promise scandal was Robert Booth Nichols. Nichols served on the board of First Intercontinental Development Corporation, FIDCO, alongside Clint Murchison, a business tycoon with organized crime connections, and Robert Maheu, the private investigator who was an intermediary between the CIA and organized crime, and who author Lisa Peace has linked to the 1968 assassination of Robert F. Kennedy. Maheu was FIDCO's vice president, while Nichols was the company's senior vice president and chairman of the investment committee. FIDCO, per Riconosciuto, was an NSC, National Security Council, corporate cutout, created to be the corporate vehicle to secure the financing for the reconstruction of the cities of Beirut and Damour in Lebanon. What? Riconosciuto further alleged that, in his dealings with FIDCO in the Middle East, he came in contact with the Promise software via a system from IBM Tel Aviv. In 1981, Nichols formed Meridian Arms with a man named Peter Zarkowski. Meridian would later join Wackenhut in its Cabazon-related activities. Michael Riconosciuto had also been Meridian's vice president on the board of directors alongside Nichols and Zarkowski for a brief period. Meridian Arms was a subsidiary of Meridian International Logistics, and that company's board of directors included Nichols, Zarkowski, and Eugene Gianquinto. Gianquinto was notably the president of the home entertainment division of MCA, the entertainment giant that was later acquired by the Bronfman-Seagram Company and reincorporated as Universal Studios. What the fuck? What the fuck? Holy shit. One of MCA's top executives, as noted in Chapter 1, was Lou Wasserman, who was deeply connected to organized crime, particularly through Mo Dalitz, haven't heard that name in a while, and was largely responsible for Ronald Reagan's political career. No surprise, because Ronald Reagan was involved with MCA, and he was in Hollywood for a bit. When Reagan took office, the Department of Justice had been probing MCA's ties to organized crime, but thanks to help from Reagan's Attorney General Ed Meese, the probe was squashed. The Wasserman-Reagan relationship and Wasserman's organized crime ties are discussed in more detail in the next chapter. Ooh. Another member of the NCA board at this time, Senator Howard Baker, would also later advise Robert Maxwell about his entry into New York in the early 1990s, alongside John Tower and Robert Keith Gray. Baker was also a business partner of Maxwell's at that time. See Chapter 15 for more. According to Sherry Seymour, both Gianquinto of MCA and Nichols of Meridian had a close working relationship with the Justice Department, and Gianquinto, in a recorded FBI wiretapped conversation referenced by Seymour, took credit for contacting Meese to have the DOJ's MCA organized crime probe quashed in the early 1980s. One of the special prosecutors for the Justice Department who had worked on the MCA case, Richard Stavin, obtained documents that identified Nichols as a money launderer with ties to the Gambino crime family and the Yakuza, Japanese organized crime. The fuck? God damn. Talk about our government really being organized crime. Per Seymour, Nichols also had ties to Ferdinand Marcos of the Philippines, having reportedly laundered between 50 to 200 million on his behalf. Nichols was also investigated by the FBI in the late 1970s for money laundering for Marcos as well as drug smuggling. That investigation also found evidence that Nichols had also sold weapons to the Marcos government and other foreign governments. Much of his money laundering activities, including those on behalf of the Marcos family, reportedly involved the Swiss banking system. The FBI found that Nichols had claimed to have had access to highly sophisticated computers in Switzerland with detailed information on a number of subjects, suggesting that Nichols may have been using Promise as part of his Swiss laundromat. Nichols, according to the FBI report, had also claimed to have highly placed sources in numerous foreign government agencies, which can detect any investigation initiated against him. One of these individuals was supposedly a United States senator with much seniority whom Nichols claimed to utilize in the trafficking of narcotics and money laundering. Given that Nichols, via Eugene Gianquinto, was just 1 degree of separation from Senator Howard Baker, who was also on the board of the organized crime-linked MCA and later engaged in suspect business activities with Robert Maxwell. The Tennessee senator seems like a potential suspect. You don't say. This is getting crazy. Nichols also loomed large in the tragic fate of journalist Danny Casolaro, the journalist who was assassinated, by the way. Or who was offed. Let me just say offed. Offed. Casolaro had been investigating an international crime syndicate he termed the Octopus at the time of his death in 1991. Casolaro believed that this octopus involved powerful individuals in the private and public sectors as well as the criminal underworld, and that they were collectively responsible for some of the biggest scandals of the 1980s, including Iran-Contra, BCCI, and the theft of the Promise software. Dan dealt in this nebulous shadowy world. Dick O'Connell, a friend of Casolaro's and publisher of Washington Crime News Services, said in mid-August 1991 to the Associated Press. He was saying they took that install software and sold it overseas and took the profits from that and turned it into arms for the Contras. That's what he was working on, and he told me he thought BCCI was the conduit for all these money transactions. Sherry Seymour notes that Casolaro's work on the Octopus had encompassed the October Surprise story, the Insular computer software case, the Iran-Contra affair, the BCCI scandal, and MCA Entertainment Corporation, all overlapping and interconnecting into one network. Before his death, Casolaro had called this network a dirty CIA old boy network that, per Seymour, had begun working together in the 1950s around the Albania covert operations. These men had gotten into the illegal gun and drug trade back then and had continued in that business ever since. Shortly before his death, Casolaro had told friends and family that he was close to concluding his investigation. Several people close to him had seen documents involving money transfers involving BCCI and the World Bank to people involved in these scandals, such as, wait for it, Earl Bryan, and wait for it, Adnan Khashoggi. In July 1991, something strange happened, and Casolaro suddenly became somewhat alarmed. It appears to have been a threat from Robert Booth Nichols, who had initially been a source for Casolaro before warning him, "If you continue this investigation, you will die." Casolaro, later that same month, learned from former DOJ Special Prosecutor Richard Stavin that Nichols was deeply enmeshed in organized crime networks as well as intelligence networks. There we go again. That sordid union. Shortly thereafter, on August 5th, 1991, Michael Riconosciuto contacted Bill Hamilton and asked him to use his sources to dig up info on a man named Mike Abel. Abel had worked at the Department of Justice in the early 1980s, where he was director of the Office of International Affairs before going into private legal practice. Hamilton ultimately passed the task of investigating Abel over to Casolaro, who contacted his own sources about ties between Abel, Robert Booth Nichols, and Gilberto Rodriguez, an early leader of the Cali cartel. The Cali cartel's connections to Contra support efforts and to E-Systems were discussed in Chapter 7 and earlier in this chapter, respectively. Years later, in 1994, Abel's law offices were raided by the FBI in connection with an investigation into Cali cartel money laundering, and Abel was subsequently charged and convicted for being directly involved in the cartel's activities. The following day, Casolaro traveled to Martinsburg, Virginia, to meet with some sources to get the final piece of the puzzle and bring back the head of the octopus. 2 days after arriving in Martinsburg, Casolaro was found dead in his hotel room, and his briefcase full of his research notes and evidence was missing. His death was ruled a suicide. Right. His death was ruled a suicide. Many, including Casolaro's family, do not believe that Casolaro committed suicide. A week before his death, Casolaro told his brother he had been receiving death threats, and the manner in which he died, deep slashes in his arms, was not consistent with Casolaro's well-known squeamishness, even around minor amounts of blood. So he didn't like seeing blood at all. Deep slashes. But yeah, he died by suicide. Right. Speculation only grew following the FBI investigation, given that the FBI lied to Congress, pressured its own agents not to question whether it was a suicide, and lost 90% of its files related to Casolaro's death, among other glaring inconsistencies. In a 1994 letter provided to me as in Whitney Webb, in 2019 by Insaw Inc., Insular lawyer Charles Work told then Assistant Attorney General John Dwyer that one of Insular's confidential sources in government had stated that Casolaro had been injected with a substance that deadened his nerves from the neck down, explaining the apparent lack of struggle on Casolaro's part, and that the substance had come from the U.S. Army inventory. U.S. Army inventory. Oh, shit. The person who had arranged Casolaro's final meeting before his death was a U.S. military intelligence officer named Joseph Cuellar. Prior to Casolaro's death, Cuellar had promised to arrange a meeting between Casolaro and Peter Videnix, a Department of Justice contracting official with responsibility for the promised software, who was a close associate of Earl Bryan. Something smells. Videnix, before joining the Department of Justice, had previously worked as a contracting officer at U.S. Customs during the years of Operation Condor, and was in a position where he could have handled contracts related to E-Systems and Evergreen International. The same year that Casolaro died, there were several other suspicious deaths involving people directly connected to the Primus scandal or involved in Casolaro's investigation of the octopus, including Alan Standorf, one of Casolaro's sources, Robert Maxwell, the father is Ghislaine Maxwell, and the intelligence-linked salesman of the bugged Primus software, and John Tower, the former Texas senator who assisted Maxwell in selling the bugged Primus software to the Los Alamos laboratories. Other aspects of Robert Maxwell's death are dealt with in Chapter 15. Around this same time, the Primus scandal or Insular affair itself became too unruly, especially after several congressional investigators concluded wrongdoing by the Justice Department and called for a special prosecutor to be appointed. That appointment was made by none other than the then Attorney General under George H.W. Bush, William Barr. As previously mentioned in Chapter 8, Barr had not only had an alleged role in major aspects of Iran-Contra under the alias Robert Johnson, but he had begun his career at the CIA, as was said earlier and deduced. As will be discussed in Chapter 11, Barr's employment with the CIA overlapped with his father's decision to hire Jeffrey Epstein at the Dalton School, which would prove essential in Epstein's rise to prominence in these same networks. Early on, Barr essentially stonewalled Congress by denying congressmen access to privileged documents related to Primus and Insular Inc., much like he had done years earlier when he stonewalled the Church Committee on behalf of the CIA. As a result, a congressional hearing was held in December 1990 on Barr's continued refusal to make the documents available. After considerable political pressure, Barr moved to appoint a special counsel to investigate the Insular affair, appointing a retired judge from Chicago named Nicholas Bua to serve in that role in September 1992. Bua authored a 267-page report, which he completed in early 1993, that claimed to find no credible evidence to support the Hamiltons' allegations, and the report has been widely criticized as a whitewash of the whole situation. You don't say. After Inslaw's Bill Hamilton distributed Inslaw's heavily detailed rebuttal of the BUA report to members of House Judiciary Committee, Congressman Jack Brooks, Democrat, Texas, and Charlie Rose, Democrat, North Carolina, attempted to force an investigation of the Justice Department as related to Promise, as well as an investigation into the death of journalist Danny Casolaro and the payment of reparations to the Hamiltons. Despite their best efforts and the continued efforts of the Hamiltons through the decades, the Promise scandal, Casolaro's death, and other matters that swirl around the entity Casolaro called the Octopus remain largely uninvestigated by the federal government and most of mainstream media to this day. I'm going to say a show of hands, they will never ever talk about it again, because I had to do some digging to find out about this and read this to find out about this, and it would never be covered on legacy media. Now we move from the man who knew too much. Yeah, it's nuts. It is insane. It is insane. From the man who knew too much to the CDC and tech transfers. Ugh, good grief. Good grief. As previously mentioned, prior to Casolaro's death, those close to the journalist had seen documents involving money transfers involving the World Bank to people involved in these scandals, such as Earl Bryan and Adnan Khashoggi. In addition, it was reported by economist and author J. Orland Grab that this particular version of Promise, in use by the World Bank, was being used to track wire transfers in connection with a money laundering operation that went from BCCI London through the World Bank and into Caribbean institutions. The role of the World Bank in the Promise scandal has been largely unexplored. However, the trail left by the company that managed Promise for the financial institution, Control Data Corporation, itself leads to a different yet parallel operation involving technology transfers to the Soviet Union. Both Robert Maxwell and, subsequently, the Gouletis family, close associates of Jeffrey Epstein, would have their own run-ins with the company. Control Data Corporation was originally formed in 1946 under the name Engineering Research Associates, ERA. ERA had been created by a group of engineers who had worked for a wartime naval division involved in code breaking and cryptography called the Communications Supplemental Activity. Ooh. The core ERA team eventually broke away from the original company and formed Control Data Corporation, CDC, in September 1957. From the beginning, CDC was a major defense contractor. During the 1970s, CDC computers were installed at Sandia National Laboratories, which would become the target of Robert Maxwell's marketing of Promise roughly a decade later. CDC had developed special code expressly for the products it sold to Sandia, which, as previously mentioned, dealt with aspects of the U.S. nuclear program. CDC computers, also containing specially designed code, were also present at Oak Ridge Laboratories, which also played a role in development of the nuclear program. CDC also had a long-standing relationship with the Soviet Union's nuclear laboratories and facilities during this same period. Oh yeah? I wasn't born. I was born in 91. But I'm pretty sure I probably find those hearings on YouTube or elsewhere. Congressional hearings from the mid-1970s revealed that in 1968, a second-generation controlled data corporation 1604 system was installed at the Dubna Soviet nuclear facility near Moscow. In 1972, CDC sold the Soviet Union a third-generation CDC 6200 system computer. For these systems, CDC's operating statement had improved by about $3 million in the past 3 years. And the Soviet Union has gained 15 years in computer technology. What? As seen here, CDC's business in the USSR raised concerns that the company was engaging in technology transfers to the United States' ostensible archenemy at the height of the Cold War. Such concerns would continue to follow the company for decades. Around this same period, in the early 1970s, CDC acquired the Commercial Credit Corporation, CCC, which had nearly gone bankrupt during the calamitous bankruptcy of Penn Central in 1970. That bankruptcy, the nation's largest until the collapse of Enron several decades later, is discussed in greater detail in the next chapter. In the years that followed, CDC and its newly acquired subsidiary, CCC, would become involved with the networks of Shackley's private CIA and rogue CIA agent and alleged sex blackmailer, Edwin Wilson. As previously detailed in Chapter 7, CCC played a key role in the creation of Global International Airways, a company created in the late 1970s by Farhad Azima, an Iranian businessman reportedly tied to Iran's pre-revolutionary intelligence system, SAVAK. That airline had been launched with the aid of a multi-million-dollar loan from Commerce Credit Corporation and was allegedly tied to Shackley's network as well as Air America, known by this time as Southern Air Transport. Global International Airways had worked with EATSCO, the company tied to the Shackley-Klein private CIA network that served as a middleman in arms deals. Wow. Also noted in Chapter 6 is the fact that CDC itself, around 1976 or so, had directly hired Edwin Wilson as a consultant with the hopes that Wilson's contacts could help with the company unload some outdated computers on third world countries. However, CDC appears to have leveraged Wilson's abilities for much more, as the rogue CIA agent was accused of bugging the U.S. Army's Material Command on behalf of the company. Whoa. Considering these associations and activities, CDC was likely much more than just a computer company, and its public claims that the company was not involved in illicit high technology transfers to the Soviet Union seems dubious at best. After the aforementioned congressional hearing in 1974, CDC made an apparent move at increasing its role in technology transfers, despite political concern. By the late 1970s, they had established a new subsidiary called World Tech, described in the press as Division of Control Data Corp that does research and consulting on and brokering of technology transfers. Once WorldTech was established by CDC, it entered into a joint venture in 1979 with Greek publisher George Bobolis that was called WorldTech Hellas Limited, where 70% was owned by Bobolis and 20% was owned by CDC. The owner of the remaining 10% was not disclosed in reports at that time. A 1979 letter from one of Bobolis' companies to a Phonin, identified as a representative of the State Committee for Foreign Economic Relations of the USSR Council of Ministers, proposed the creation of a joint development company using WorldTech for worldwide technology transfer, and stressed that WorldTech Hellas Limited will give a lot of help to technology transfer on an international base. After journalist Paul Anastasi published information about Bobolis and called him a KGB agent of influence, one of his companies, Bobtrade, asserted that no improper transfer of high technology was involved, while CDC moved to dissolve their partnership, likely due to bad publicity. Around the time that WorldTech was being created, CDC's then executive vice president, Robert D. Schmidt, was part of the American Committee on U.S.-Soviet Relations, ACUSR, previously the American Committee on East-West Accord. Other members at the time, specifically in 1977, included Robert Maxwell's lawyer and confidant, Samuel Pisar, stepfather to future U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken, as well as Thomas Watson Jr. of IBM, who would become U.S. ambassador to the Soviet Union in 1979. What the fuck? What the fuck? This is wild. This is wild. Another member was Paul Zifrin, previously discussed in Chapter 1, as a major figure in the organized crime networks that ran through Hollywood, including those tied up with Lou Wasserman and MCA. Zifrin's and Wasserman's families would later intermarry. By the mid-1980s, Occidental Petroleum executives Armand Hammer and William McSweeney would also join the ACUSR. ACUSR member Samuel Pisar also represented Hammer's business interests. As previously mentioned in Chapter 7, Hammer served as a back channel between the Americans and the Soviets, and had been involved in the entry of BCCI into the U.S. financial system. Also noted was the fact that he had originally sought to acquire FGB himself for the purpose of financially blackmailing U.S. politicians. It is also worth mentioning again that Hammer's father, Julius Hammer, had once served as a Soviet spy. Another member of the ACUSR was Joseph Filner, president of NobleMet International, later NewMet Corporation. Thank you. Filner was extensively involved in USSR-US tech transfers. Filner's NobleMet created a joint venture for the purpose of tech transfers, which was called Multi-Arc. By 1984, CDC's WorldTech had become a worldwide marketing representative for Multi-Arc. CDC would later recruit Minnesota Governor Rudy Perpich after Perpich lost his re-election campaign in 1979. Perpich, a dentist by training, would specifically work for CDC overseas as vice president. And hold up, a dentist by training would specifically work for CDC overseas as vice president and executive consultant for Control Data World Tech Inc. The New York Times, reporting on his hire by CDC in January 1979, stated that Perpich was expected to be based in Yugoslavia, but he said he could find himself in Hungary, Bulgaria, or Romania. Robert Maxwell was also intimately in Eastern Europe, specifically in Bulgaria, which is discussed at the end of this chapter. Perpich, after working for World Tech, would win another term as Minnesota's governor in 1983. CDC would also recruit another influential politician, Walter Mondale, who was hired by CDC right after he left office as Jimmy Carter's vice president. CDC hired Mondale as a legal consultant and retained his services for $2,000 per month, which is about $6,360 in 2022 dollars, which was when this book was released. Simultaneously, Mondale was also a consultant to Allen & Company, the company of the organized crime-linked Charles and Herbert Allen, mentioned throughout this book. Mondale was not only a consultant to, but also a close friend of the Allen brothers. The Allen brothers also worked closely with organized crime interests, as well as Leslie Wexner's mentors, Max Fisher and Alfred Talman, discussed in detail in Chapter 13. As previously mentioned earlier in this chapter, Allen & Co. had a close business association with Earl Bryan and had financed one of his attempts to buy out Bill Hamilton's Inslaw. By 1983, CDC was providing its services to the World Bank's computer center, and that same year, the Promise software was found to be in use at that specific facility to keep track of wire transfers of money. This is according to a sworn statement that Inslaw Inc. obtained from David McCallum in 1995. In 1983, McCallum was working for CDC at the World Bank. In my correspondence with Inslaw's Bill Hamilton, he stated the following. According to an article in the International Banking Regulator dated January 17, 1994, U.S. Justice Department officials delivered the VAX version of Promise to the World Bank in 1983. The World Bank, as an international institution, is outside the reach of discovery of the U.S. courts. For its part, the World Bank declares that it has been unable to find any evidence that it ever possessed the VAX version of Promise. Hamilton also relayed that he had once been informed of a connection between CDC and Promise that involved the Deputy Attorney General under Ed Meese, D. Lowell Jensen. However, he could no longer remember the specifics of that connection. As previously mentioned, among the connections Danny Castellaro revealed to those close to him in the days and weeks before his death, he had specifically mentioned the World Bank. There was talk specifically about money transfers involving BCCI and the World Bank to individuals such as Earl Bryan and Adnan Khashoggi. Given that the documentation of those transfers mysteriously disappeared from Castellaro's hotel room at the time of his death, CDC's apparent involvement with the World Bank's use of Promise takes on increased significance. Also significant is the role CDC played during the 1990 visit to Mikhail Gorbachev, the then leader of the Soviet Union, to the United States. During the trip, Gorbachev visited CDC headquarters alongside Rudy Perpich, as well as Robert Maxwell. The Gorbachevs arrived in Minnesota immediately after a summit meeting in Washington with then-President George H.W. Bush. According to a report from the Minnesota Historical Society, Gorbachev most likely agreed to the visit, Minnesota, because several Minnesota-based corporations, especially the computer firm Control Data Corporation, had long done business with the Soviet Union. When the corporation's officials learned that Gorbachev was interested in a post-summit tour, they passed the word to Perpich, who had worked for Control Data between his 2 terms as governor. Albert Ezeli, who had been a consultant for Control Data and earlier was Vice President Walter Mondale's press secretary, drafted the governor's letter inviting the Gorbachevs. Former Control Data CEO Robert Price personally delivered the letter to the Soviet embassy on February 26, 1990. During the visit, Gorbachev attended a lunch at the governor's mansion, where Robert Maxwell and Rudy Perpich joined groups of Soviet and American officials. One of the American officials present was, hold up, Condoleezza Rice, the future Secretary of State who was then a National Security Council staff member. Afterwards, there was a press conference where Robert Maxwell, in characteristic bombastic fashion, announced that he would donate $50 million to help create a private research institution to be called the Gorbachev-Maxwell Institute of Technology. Maxwell said that the donation was contingent on Perpich raising matching funds. The institute was never launched. After visiting Minnesota, Gorbachev next visited Silicon Valley, where he spent a week trying to perfect the art of winning acceptance and investment from the captains of capitalism. A Washington Post article on his visit quoted John Sculley, then head of Apple Computers, as saying, "I think Gorbachev got to us. We'll all be thinking about business with the Soviet Union in a way we wouldn't have if he hadn't come." That's the end of the CDC portion of this chapter. Now we get to Maxwell and Multigroup. Robert Maxwell's involvement in intelligence-linked technology transfers was considerable and went far beyond his tangential involvement with Control Data Corporation, as detailed above. The most important of these involved Maxwell's relationship with Bulgarian intelligence and his role in the operation known as Neva. Maxwell had long been interested in Bulgaria, even before he was first brought into Mossad's fold in the 1960s. In one of his earliest meetings with Vladimir Khrushchev, the KGB chief, and one of the most powerful of Maxwell's sources, Maxwell had raised the possibility that Bulgaria might be a country where he could invest his money away from prying eyes in the city of London and Wall Street. Khrushchev later granted him permission to establish a financial bunker in the Bulgarian capital, Sofia. Maxwell, years later, and after he established a close relationship with Bulgarian leadership and the top figures in its intelligence service, would go on to sell the bugged Promise software to Bulgarian intelligence, the proceeds of which were laundered and eventually made available to finance Mossad's black operations. Out of Maxwell's associations with Bulgarian intelligence came a program called NEVA. NEVA, per Gordon Thomas, was designed to be the single largest program for the mass-scale theft of U.S. technology and sought to plunder every Western industrialized nation. The program was operated by Bulgarian intelligence, whose agents would steal technology and bring it into Bulgaria, usually under diplomatic cover. Bulgarian companies owned by Maxwell would then re-engineer the stolen equipment, and then those companies would resell those products to other Eastern Bloc countries. The fuck? Yo! This is nuts! Oh my God. One of the men who developed NEVA alongside Maxwell, Ognian Doinov, president of the Bulgarian Chamber for Industry and Trade from 1980 to 1984, and Bulgaria's vice premier from 1984 to 1986, claimed that Bulgarian intelligence agents involved in NEVA had been working covertly in Silicon Valley and other key technology centers in the United States, as well as in Britain and other Western countries. There, they would steal technology blueprints, actual software, even computers. Oh my fucking God. Yo, this is wild. This is Ghislaine Maxwell's father. Yo, this is fucking wild. According to Gordon Thomas, Maxwell created an umbrella of companies for use in NEVA within 6 months. Thanks to Maxwell, Thomas writes, the country had to become the center of a thriving economy based upon whole-scale theft and money laundering. This growing business empire, Thomas asserts, would later grow into one of the most powerful crime syndicates in the world, embracing the Russian mafia, the crime families of Bulgaria, and far away across the Atlantic, those in New York, and on the other side of the world, the crime families of Japan and Hong Kong. The beginnings of this crime syndicate can be found in the umbrella corporation that would combine the companies Maxwell had created to operate NEVA, Multigroup. Multigroup would go on to control a significant percentage of the global profits from gas, telecommunications, oil, gambling, and money laundering. It would later emerge that NEVA companies, many of which were now part of Multigroup, were used as cover by Mossad with Maxwell's blessing. John Patrick O'Neill, FBI executive agent in charge in New York until 2001, would later say the following about Maxwell and Multigroup. In many ways, Maxwell was at the heart of the global criminal network, you don't fucking say. Beginning with his Bulgarian connection, he showed how to structure a network that grew into financially powerful criminal corporations whose power would extend to the South American drug cartels, the Tongs and the Triads, the Russian Mafia, and the Japanese Yakuza. They were all there before. But the way Robert Maxwell set up things up, they would all come together in multi-group in its early years. His last contribution was not that he just robbed his pension funds. It was that he was the man who set in motion a true coalition of global criminals. Another Maxwell company that was based in the U.S. has been suspected in playing some role in the naval program. In 1985, Maxwell created Pergamon Brassy, registering the company in McLean, Virginia. He and his son Kevin were listed as directors. 2 years later, in 1987, the company underwent a major shakeup, and former Senator John Tower, who had been a major accomplice of Maxwell's in the Promise scandal, became chairman of its board. Prominent former generals of the U.S. and British militaries were also added to the company's board. According to Bill Hamilton of Inslaw, Inc., Pergamon Brassy seemed to have more connections to Promise, aside from Robert Maxwell and John Tower. In 1987, Pergamon Brassy hired 2 senior computer systems executives who resigned at the same time from the Meese Justice Department's Justice Data Center. The proprietary IBM mainframe version of Promise had been operating at the Justice Data Center since the early 80s. George Vavaris resigned his estimated $90,000 a year senior executive service position as director of the Justice Data Center to become vice president for technical services at the tiny Pergamon Brassy. He told a colleague at the Justice Department his new salary would be in excess of $200,000 a year. Pergamon Brassy was a specialist company with no more than 6 employees on its payroll at any given time. While it did publish books on topics related to national security and intelligence, it primarily dealt with software that some suspect may have been part of Maxwell's sprawling, never-related operations. A year after Pergamon Brassy was revamped and Tower installed as its chairman, Maxwell became involved with the notorious Russian mobster Semyon Mogilevich. Mogilevich was part of a plan that had been pitched to Maxwell and designed by Vladimir Krychkov. Gordon Thomas relays that plan as follows. Even more fearful at the pace at which perestroika was accelerating, Krychkov said that for the KGB to remain a potent force, he wanted to establish over 600 commercial enterprises. They would all have links to the West, just as Maxwell's companies provided cover for Mossad's Katsas. Krychkov envisaged his companies would provide similar protection for KGB operatives. The 600 companies would each employ a quota of senior party members to provide them with an income during the difficult days ahead in the transition from communism to capitalism. Through genuine trading links, the companies would obtain access to the very heart of capitalism, Wall Street, and the City of London, and the bourses of Western Europe. Its staffs would learn the innermost secrets of the West's banking system, the wellspring of all capitalism. Eventually, it might even be possible to destabilize Western economies and pave the way for the return of communism. The year he met Maxwell, In 1988, Mogilevich was granted an Israeli passport thanks to Maxwell's lobbying of Israel's government on his behalf. With this passport, Mogilevich soon established a web of seemingly legitimate companies in Israel, the United States, and the United Kingdom, which were used to launder his illicit profits from his considerable involvement in weapons deals, drug trafficking, and human trafficking. A year after meeting Maxwell, Mogilevich's criminal profits grew considerably, reaching an estimated $40 billion annually. The fuck? Maxwell subsequently became a business partner of Mogilevich, as well as Ivo Janchev, a Bulgarian intelligence officer linked up with Mogilevich and other organized crime figures in the Eastern Bloc. Janchev was also allegedly part of Khrushchev's plan and was tasked with acting as the front man to make contact with several Russians with businesses in the West. Maxwell would ultimately play a crucial role in allowing these organized crime interests to enter into the world of respectable international finance. It is unknown if anything ever resulted from Khrushchev's plan, but Maxwell's connections to Mogilevich, Janchev, and other unsavory characters would undeniably have a considerable impact on the expansion of the mobsters' legitimate and illegitimate businesses, and foster the expansion of the global criminal network that Maxwell had helped spawn through Multigroup. Holy shit. So we just learned about Multigroup. Holy shit. God damn. Holy shit. Holy shit. Now we go from Cold Wars to hot money. From Cold Wars to hot money, and that will be the end of this chapter. From Cold Wars to hot money, the final portion. According to Tom Bauer's biography of Maxwell, the tycoon spent a considerable amount of time in Moscow in 1991. There, he was negotiating the purchase of approximately $1 billion worth of gold. The sellers were reportedly KGB officers, and the outcome of the exchange has been shrouded in secrecy. Per the account in Bauer's book, Maxwell went to Moscow to secure the gold, only to discover that it had been lost. Other versions of the tale suggest that Maxwell wasn't acting alone, and that he was once again operating in tandem with the Mossad. According to this account, the gold actually found its way to Israel, not an uncommon destination for assets that had flowed out of the Eastern Bloc during and after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Throughout 1991, stories of massive outflows of Soviet gold circulated about, with many naming sums considerably higher than the $1 billion that Maxwell was purportedly seeking to acquire. In the spring of that year, a report reappeared in the Manchester Guardian that a package worth $12 billion was moved from the USSR outside of normal export channels. Several months later, Grigory Yavlinsky, the Russian economist tapped by Gorbachev to help oversee Soviet economic reforms, told stunned world leaders at a G7 summit that Russia's gold reserves had dwindled from 2,000 to 3,000 tons to 240 tons. What the fuck? Even before the Soviet Union collapsed, looting was taking place on a colossal scale. According to Claire Sterling's book, Thieves' World, an army of strange and dubious figures descended upon Europe in 1991, offering to sell off massive amounts of Russian gold. One of these figures, subsequently well known in conspiracy circles for his questionable claims, was an American mob-linked conman named Leo Wanta. In league with several mafioso and other faceless investors, Wanta blanketed trading houses across the globe with faxed offers to sell 2,000 tons of gold. At the same time, Roberto Coppola, an Italian boasting credentials identifying him as a member of the Knights of Malta, was likewise trying to sell off the exact same amount of gold. According to a source for Sterling, that she refers to only as Mr. X, Roberto Coppola was the source of all the gold that Wanta was offering. Were there any links between the Wanta-Coppola gold sales and Maxwell's attempts to buy up Soviet gold? One tantalizing possibility can be found in the Atlas dossier discussed in Chapter 7, which outlined a criminal network connected to the corrupt Belgian-Costa Rican diplomat Felix Przybylski. The dossier names an American company called New Republic as one of the vehicles through which Przybylski's group laundered money, mostly profits accrued through arms and drug trafficking. Documents reproduced by Sterling in her book showed that Wanta was offering the gold through his U.S.-based company, New Republic USA Financial Group Limited. There were a number of ties, albeit links one or two steps removed, between Przybylski's group and Maxwell's network. There is the fact, for instance, that Bruce Rappaport called upon the legal resources of a law office where Przybylski's son was a partner. Rappaport and Maxwell had a number of mutual associates that included attorney Samuel Pizar, banker Edmund Safra, and Russian mobster Semyon Mogilevich. Among similar lines, the Atlas dossier identifies Safra's Republic National Bank as one of its money laundering outlets. There was also the reason the dossier had been drafted in the first place: the looting-induced collapse of a company called Komule S.A. by the associate of the Przybylski Group. According to the dossier, Komule had been taken over by Russians and injected with money from Israel. During the 1980s, Komule was owned by Lorno, the corporate flagship of Maxwell's friend, Tiny Rowland. Throughout the later period of the Cold War, the intelligence services of the Eastern Bloc established trading companies and corporate fronts, often obscured behind walls of ownership, through which they could simultaneously conduct espionage operations and obtain hard currency for cash-starved states. East Germany's Cocoa was one example, as was Kintex in Bulgaria, which Maxwell certainly would have done business with. These and entities like Bulgaria's multi-group subsequently became the conduits through which capital flowed out of the Eastern Bloc as the Soviet Union buckled and collapsed. Maxwell's role in multi-group shows his direct involvement in these activities. As discussed earlier in this chapter, Maxwell had struck a deal with KGB chief Vladimir Khrushchev to help manage the Secret Service's economic fronts in Europe and elsewhere. The 1991 gold deals likely arose from precisely these sorts of strategic alignments. Another KGB front that became a vehicle for capital flight that was tied to the Maxwell family was Nordec, based in Vienna and launched with the ostensible purpose of exporting fertilizer. The full details of the relationship between Nordex and the Maxwells will be discussed in Chapter 16, but for now, it is enough to mention that the firm's founder, Grigory Lachanski, had been a rising star in the Latvian Communist Party under the sponsorship of Boris Pugo, the soon-to-be chairman of the Latvian section of the KGB. Perhaps importantly, Pugo had been closely tied to KGB chief Vladimir Khrushchev, who, according to Gordon Thomas, was the one who reached out to Maxwell concerning corporate cover for Soviet economic espionage operations. After a stint in prison for theft, Luchansky landed a job as the fertilizer exporter for Adazi, a state-owned import-export company. In 1989, after a year at Adazi, he launched Nordex, which soon boasted numerous subsidiaries. These were dedicated to shipping and freight transport and were organized along with joint ventures with late Soviet companies. Soon, Nordex was swimming in the world of offshore finance, with multi-million-dollar transfers with obscure companies incorporated in tax havens such as Ireland, Liechtenstein, and the Isle of Man, making up a significant chunk of its shadowy business activity. What the fuck? It also indulged in global black market trades. According to intelligence sources cited by Andrew and Leslie Cockburn, Nordex was deeply involved in arms, drugs, the whole 9 yards. This also entailed the trade of nuclear materials such as uranium, plutonium, and beryllium. Reports in the Swiss press identify Nordex's co-founder as none other than Mark Rich, an allegation reiterated in U.S. government documents. Bruce Raphael writes in his book King Energy that Rich utilized Nordex to snap up Russian oil refineries that were being auctioned off during the post-Soviet economic transition. Yet another player in Nordex was the Swiss attorney Isa Leslinger, known for his status as a financial juggler, who had sat on over 100 boards of directors and spent time as the secretary of Zug, Switzerland's official trade association. According to press reports, Leslinger maintained connections with Western and Eastern Soviet and Eastern Secret Service agents. One of his clients had been Gunther Forber, the Stasi's front man in running the Western Germany trading company Coco. In a set of circumstances reminiscent of Control Data Corporation's Eastern Bloc activities, Forber was involved in the acquisition and transfer of high technology from the West. During the 1990s, Nordex's money laundering activities linked it with a company registered in New Jersey and active in New York City and London, called Benex International Company, Inc. Benex's offices, located in New York Borough, Queens, shared the same building with two companies connected to Luchansky. Authorities investigating Russian mob-linked money laundering activities also found the fingerprints of Mark Rich at Benex. Wire transfers were discovered between Benex and Glencore of Rich, though the transactions took place after Rich had departed from Glencore. Both Rich and Glencore denied that they had done any sort of business with Benex, because why not? Of course you would. Of course, corrupt bastards would deny their bullshit. The most glaring connections between Nordex and Benex were found in Europe. During the mid-1990s, Benex moved as much as $9 billion through a handful of companies in Paris, all of which shared the same office. The most important of these was Commerce France, controlled by brothers Igor and Oleg Berezovsky. Whether they were related to the better-known Russian oligarch Boris Berezovsky is unknown, and owned by a Swiss company called Commontrade AG. Italian investigators found that Commontrade was said to be a member of the Nordics group of companies. One of Comma's substantial shareholders was a man named Andreas Matasov, a director and shareholder in another firm called IFS Frachtservice, a subsidiary of Nordex. Finally, Commontrade was managed by Lenzlinger and Partners, a trust headed by the aforementioned Isa Lenzlinger. Benix also arose in investigations into the financial activities of Maxwell's most notorious criminal associate, Simeon Mogilevich. Money had been moved through bank accounts held by Benix to YBM Magnets International, a Pennsylvania company that had merged with a large Hungarian firm that sold industrial magnets and military hardware. YBM was firmly under the control of Mogilevich and had been capitalized with funds in New York City, London, and with funds from Aragon Limited, the heart of his criminal empire. Wow. Within 4 years of its launch, YBM grew to a billion-dollar company and embarked on an ambitious plan to use the Canadian stock market as a means of money laundering via a publicly traded shell company. That effort, however, was unsuccessful. Benix was just one part of a vast and much more complicated money laundering network that encompassed Mogilevich and a number of Russian oligarchs, as well as newly minted private banks operating in the wildly unregulated markets of the former Soviet Union. The company had been formed by Peter Berlin and his wife, Lucy Edwards, an officer in the Eastern European Division of Bank of New York, BONY. Where Benix moved hot money on behalf of Nordex and Mogilevich, it was using accounts the pair had set up at the bank and at their offices in Queens. Berlin and Edwards had installed BONY's wire transfer technology, micro cash register, on their computers. When the pair were finally busted for money laundering activities, Edwards confessed that she had been working under the assumption that what they had been doing was consistent with the practice of BONY's Eastern European Division. A lawsuit brought against BONY in the Southern District Court of New York disclosed that BONY executives were themselves close to Mogilevich. The head of the bank's Eastern European Division, Natasha Gurfinkel, was revealed to have contacts with Mogilevich via her husband, Konstantin Kagalovsky. Interestingly, Konstantin, a former Soviet economist, was Russia's representative to the IMF from 1992 through 1995 and was very close with the teams carrying out the privatization of former state-owned enterprises. According to the suit, BONY security personnel contacted the bank's chairman and CEO, Thomas Renyi, concerning these ties. Renyi, reads the legal complaint, interviewed Gurfinkel about the matter and no action was taken. I wonder why. BONY's connection to the former Eastern Bloc arose from the close relationship between the bank and Bruce Rappaport. Between 1989 and 1990, BONY purchased the stake held in Rappaport's Intermaritime Bank, IMB, by BCCI frontman leading IMB to be rechristened as Bank of New York Intermaritime Bank, BONY-IMB. Immediately following this restructuring, Rappaport went about increasing his business with the Soviet Union. In August 1990, Rappaport met with Gorbachev in Moscow to discuss a series of joint ventures between the Intermaritime Complex and the Soviet state and Soviet state-owned enterprises. Curiously, this meeting took place just 1 month after the encounter between Gorbachev and Maxwell in Minnesota. Soon, a number of joint ventures were announced. Most involved collaborators with Soviet shipbuilding enterprises, which were set up to boost the Eastern Bloc's export capacities. Others were to be dedicated to port construction, cruise lines, and to oil and gas exploration in Siberia. With Paul Helliwell's oil banking partner Burton Cantor working hard on the legal dimensions, IMB-BONY fostered ties to a number of Soviet-controlled banking entities. Correspondent banking relations were set up between a handful of joint stock banks and IMB-BONY, which only increased in number when the Soviet Union relaxed laws restricting private banking enterprises. This became the backbone of BONY's push eastward. The Eastern European Division was established, and Gerfinkel was installed as its head. Soon, she was working closely with BONY-IMB personnel and meeting personally with a number of banking executives throughout Russia and Eastern Europe. She put the micro-cash register technology on display and illustrated to interested parties how it could route U.S. dollar-denominated currency to a web of offshore banking entities. Just as BONY-IMB had done before, BONY began to accumulate a vast number of Russian correspondent banks. One particularly interesting bank that BONY and BONY-IMB were tied to was the European Union Bank, EUB, which had been named as money laundromat used by Russian organized crime figures. With operations set up in Antigua, EUB had been established by Alexander Konanikin, who just a few years prior had organized the All-Russian Exchange Bank, AREB, at the behest of the KGB. Through AREB, Konanikin aided and abetted the movement of approximately 300 million, or up to 1 billion, to the West from November 1991 through May 1992. Holy shit. When Konanikin turned his attention to Antigua, BONY and BONY-IMB weren't the only Rappaport-linked entities he did business with. EUB also maintained ties to Rappaport's own Antiguan bank, Swiss American, which he had set up with Burton Cantor and Marvin Warner, the close friend and business partner of Edward de Bartolo. Hold on. Edwin de Bartolo. Was he the former owner of the San Francisco 49ers? I could be wrong. I think he was the former owner of the San Francisco 49ers. As will be noted in Chapter 13, Edward de Bartolo was not only a close business associate of Leslie Wexner, but also a major associate of organized crime. BONY's Eastern European banking activities took on a sophisticated technological dimensions. Besides micro-cash register, the bank took steps to develop what it called ciphergrams, an encrypted communication system to allow for more direct interactions between BONY its correspondent banks, and an offshore network of banks and businesses that they used to move money. Similarly, databases were developed that provided code names for the participants, tabulated ownership shares in offshore entities, and tracked money dispersal. This and the other systems were marketed to various Russian banks on BONY's client list. Both the ciphergrams and the database systems were part of an effort to help develop a technique created by Gerfinkel, the manager of Incombank, one of BONY's largest Russian banking clients, and a mysterious individual named Bob Klein called Prokutki, or spinning around. As the Southern District of New York's suit against BONY described it, spinning around was an elaborate means of laundering money around the world. After a major investment was placed by a Russian customer with Incombank or one of its satellite offshore companies, BONY would execute a series of electronic fund transfers, EFTs, from the Incombank U.S. dollars accounts to specific offshore front companies and bank accounts. Usually, several layers of these electronic fund transfers to offshore entities were executed in succession, hence the name spinning around. The ultimate goal of the spinning around scheme was to obscure and disguise the true origin of the funds being moved through the BONY accounts. The spinning around scheme allowed Incombank's customer to evade payment of Russian taxes and duties and provided the ability to launder proceeds from illegal acts. The conspirators generated commission payments, or skim, based on a percentage of the total amount of money moved through the network out of Russia. The commissions, also referred to as consulting fees, were ultimately diverted for the benefit of the conspirators through BONY to offshore entities. What the fuck? To make matters even more complicated, the existence of Bob Klein himself remains an open question. In various legal declarations and investigations, he has been described as a close associate and representative of both Rappaport and BONY chairman Thomas Redney. Two BONY employees testified under oath that they had met Klein, but neither any BONY IMB office logs nor BONY internal paperwork ever mentioned his name. Alan Block and Constance Weaver, authors of the most definitive work on Rappaport and his decades of corruption, concluded that Klein was something of a fiction deployed to obscure the inner workings of BONY's criminal activities. We have met the man who invented Klein, they write. While they don't name this individual, they do pass along the ominous statement that he gave them. How can we ever know who someone really is in any case? Passports can be faked. Records can be forged. How can we really know? This financial maze came crumbling down in August 1998, thanks to an untimely intervention by a surprising party, Republic National Bank, RNB, the bank controlled by Maxwell's close friend, Edmund Safra. RNB drafted a suspicious activities report and turned it over to the treasuries, outlining evidence of strange transactions between RNB, BONY, and a handful of companies, including Benex. On August 5th, Louis Shaliro at the Justice Department sent a letter to Dov Schlein, chairman of RNB, thanking him for the bank's report. In the letter, Shaliro wrote that RNB had assisted the New York office of the Federal Bureau of Investigation in an ongoing major money laundering investigation. Suspicions have been raised about the supposed altruism of RMB, a bank that, as discussed in other chapters, was linked to Iran-Contra, Colombian cartel money laundering, the Pressborski Group, and drug traffickers operating in the Middle East. Indeed, Block and Weaver write that RMB had been obnoxiously crooked for some time, and may have taken the high road in order to protect itself. In other words, RMB was getting out ahead of an FBI probe that might have exposed whatever banking affairs it was indulging in with BONY and its affiliates. RMB itself had a long history of involvement with both Russian organized crime figures and with the troubled Russian economy in the years that followed the end of the Cold War. It held accounts, for example, used by Shabtai Kamanovich, a Russian-Israeli entrepreneur and insider to the world of the Russian-American mob operating from Brighton Beach. Kamanovich brought with him, unsurprisingly, ties to the world of intelligence services. During the height of the Cold War, he was tied closely to the KGB and the Mossad, and like Maxwell, appears to have served as back channel between them and other intelligence agencies. Holy fuck. There might have been other allegations that Kalmanovich has served as a point of contact for Jonathan Pollard, the infamous Israeli spy operating within the U.S. intelligence community. At the beginning of 1992, the U.S. Federal Reserve began an ambitious project of injecting money into Russia by selling dollars to its leading banks. RMB was the Fed's principal agent in these transactions, which saw RMB obtaining dollars from the central bank, which would then be transported by courier to Russia to be sold. The sum of these dollars was soon in excess of 80 billion, far outstripping the value of all the Russian rubles in circulation. While the ostensible goal of the Federal Reserve was to preserve the beleaguered Russian banking industry, the flood of dollars was a boon for organized crime. Many of the banks that were on the receiving end of the trade were controlled by criminal enterprises, and not an insignificant portion of these funds was being funneled into offshore zones by laundering webs like the one operated by BONY. With the dollar flows leaving Russia at a rapid rate, and the general problem of large-scale capital flight, Russia was teetering on the brink of crisis by 1998. These factors were compounded by the Asian financial crisis, which led to a global dip in the supply of oil and other mineral resources and caused a decline in exports. At its climax, Russia faced a run on its banks. In response, the IMF put in motion an emergency stabilization credit for Russia valued at $11.2 billion, $4.8 billion of which was made immediately available to the country's central bank. Yet, within a month, the Russian financial crisis had set in, and RMB was alerting authorities about suspicious transactions. The reason for the former, and almost certainly the latter, was that the IMF credits had vanished into the financial void. Following a forensic analysis of the complex web of transfers following the $4.8 billion credit, Russia's Prosecutor General, Yuri Skuratov, announced that the lion's share of the funds had gone to commercial banks, who then used their corresponding banking relations to siphon the money back out of Russia. Aiding and abetting this theft, he continued, was BONY. Meanwhile, in Czechoslovakia, investigators began tracing transactions between BONY and Komercini Bank. They were certain these transactions were a part of the money laundering operation of IMF funds. Soon, independent investigators into BONY and the IMF credit were underway in financial centers from London to Zurich. BONY was not the lone recipient of the money. The Russian Ministry of Finance charged that portions of the money had flowed into an account held at RBN that was used to sell currency on foreign exchanges. According to the Russian paper Novaya Gazeta, Edmund Safra was spooked by the financial crisis that had ensued and began turning evidence over to the FBI. This timing here certainly overlaps with that of RBN blowing the whistle on BONY, while Safra was reported to have had periodic conversations with FBI representatives that lasted almost a year. Oleg Yury, a journalist for the Novaya Gazeta, subsequently reported that in the fall of 1999, Safra was visited at his French estate by the Russian oligarch Boris Berezovsky, one of Russia's wealthiest individuals and a part of Boris Yeltsin's inner circle. Numerous press reports show that by August of that year, the probes into BONY's money laundering had ensnared Berezovsky. According to Lurie, Safra and Berezovsky had an increasingly angry conversation that lasted several hours, after which Safra fled in panic to his heavily fortified Monte Carlo residence. I couldn't understand why. Several months later, at the beginning of December, Safra was dead. The official cause of death was suffocation from a fire in his Monte Carlo estate that had been caused by exceedingly bizarre circumstances. His bodyguards, many of whom were veterans of Mossad, were not present that night. What? In early reports, 2 hooded intruders entered Safra's residences. They were fought off by one of Safra's nurses and former Green Beret, Ted Mayer, although he was stabbed in the process. Mayer then ushered Safra and his fellow nurse, Vivian Torrente, into a secure room and proceeded to attempt to alert the authorities, though oddly enough, the only means at his disposal, starting a fire in a waste basket to set off the fire alarms. For whatever reason, it took the fire department and the police 2.5 hours to arrive on the scene. By the time they had arrived, Safra and Torrente had already succumbed to the fire's fumes. The story very quickly changed. In the end, the court found that Mayer himself was to blame. As the story goes, the military veteran had hoped to impress Safra by staging the attack and setting the fire. To make it seem more realistic, he had stabbed himself. Once in court, stories swirled that Mayer was troubled and that his behavior had become increasingly erratic, and lawyers speculated that this was linked to a family history of schizophrenia. We can exclude with certainty all conjectures of any international conspiracy, declared the Safra family attorney, before adding that the fact that Mayer is unstable became apparent to us only after the accident. Others were not convinced. According to Vanity Fair journalist Dominic Dunn, an associate of the Safra family told him that among friends, we avoid talking about it. It might not be what it is. What really happened that night in Monaco will likely never be known. However, Safra's fate closely parallels the murky death of his friend, Robert Maxwell, nearly a decade prior, amid a similar whirlwind of strange transactions and Eastern European intrigue. While other giants moving in these same shadows, like Bruce Rappaport, managed to slip away. The deaths of Maxwell and Safra are something like bookends to the 90s, the decade where the U.S. and its allies emerged victorious from the Cold War, and everything belonging to the defeated went up for sale. And that ends chapter 9 of High Tech Treason within One Nation Under Blackmail. That was a wild chapter. That was an insane chapter. Everybody should be in jail for treason to the likes we never saw, but they can't do that because they're all compromised. Dead or compromised. Well, they're all compromised, but that was crazy. With that, I'm not going to do a reading tomorrow, but I'll do one on Thursday. I have a audition major audition coming up tomorrow. So with that, have a good night. Stay learned. Push the like button if you want me to continue doing these readings, which I will. And have a good night, because I do need to get something to eat for dinner. See you on Thursday.